Translation from German. The document reprinted below is a secret memorandum issued by the German Geopolitical Center in Madrid. It constitutes a general analysis of the world political situation after the Korean War broke out. The Madrid Geopolitical Center issues secret memoranda of this type from time to time, which are distributed among key German circles in Bonn as well as in other parts of the world. There is no doubt that the Madrid document constitutes something like a blueprint for the foreign policy of the Bonn government. In a larger sense, the Madrid circular letter is a general staff plan for a new German approach to divide and conquer the world. SG-23. Top secret. The war in Korea and world political possibilities for Germany and Europe. 1. The world situation 5 years after Potsdam. The war in Korea has brought the world political situation to a climax with such momentum that we must reckon seriously with the possibility of a third world war. The repercussions and the impact of the Korea conflict are unforeseeable at the moment, and no predictions can be made as to the possible turn of events. Certain political and military factors stand out. Russia has used the 5 years interval since the end of the war to strengthen her military preparedness in an extraordinary manner, whereas the United States and the Western coalition have neglected their military establishment. 209. Among the unknown imponderables are the following: secret weapons, new tactics, planning for sabotage, extent of future destruction, choice of theaters of war, and of neutral zones. The critical world situation compels unemotional and painstaking pondering of all these factors which, in a favorable or unfavorable manner, might influence the future of Germany and Europe. The war in Korea can bring great opportunities to Germany if she follows a prudent foreign policy. In fact, Germany has already gained many advantages thanks to the present war situation. Nonetheless, there is the danger that through false steps or through the chain reaction of events, the whole of Europe will be swamped by a tidal wave of unimaginable destruction. Such an event must be prevented at all cost. Everything today depends on a far-sighted, subtle and quick-shifting policy which must constantly bear in mind not only the future of Germany, but the destiny of Europe as a whole. We must, by all means, prevent a development whereby Europe will be destroyed between the Russian and the American millstones. 2. The role of Germany and Europe in the present crisis. Not merely Germany, but the whole of Europe has been bled white and is not now in a position to act as a decisive factor in world politics. The aim of German policy, and that of Europe as a whole, must be to remain neutral in any new world conflict no matter the circumstances. This is especially important for Germany, for she still has a long way to go until she can regain her political freedom and her economic strength to the fullest extent. Germany has exploited the tension between the East and the West to the utmost, and she must continue her efforts in that direction. She must endeavor to influence discreetly the shaping of the future. Not only is it decisive how Germany acts in her own interest, but she in turn is also greatly affected by the policies of the other European powers. England and France today are perhaps more dependent on the United States than the still occupied West German Republic. Europe, on the one hand, is today in an unenviable strategic position, but, on the other hand, it enjoys the advantage of being the geopolitical center astride the Soviet Colossus and the USA. Present circumstances make it therefore necessary for Europe to be on guard against both sides in order to avoid being swallowed up by one of their two colossi. The dollar imperialism is certainly in no way less aggressive or reckless than communism. The British and French, although former allies and victors, feel the impact of that arrogant dollar diplomacy to a greater extent than we Germans, whose sympathy they, USA, helped to gain. Today Western Europe is relegated to the role of a satellite acting on behalf of America. Schumann in France, and Bevin in England, dance to the tune of the piper in Washington. Europe is being used as the playground for the impudent and shameless dollar diplomacy. Thanks to their solid political education, middle class and labor in Germany have been able to grasp the whole situation in time. Occasionally there arises in France and England resentment against the United States also, but, unfortunately, it is too often linked with attacks against Germany. During the forthcoming months, Germany's foreign policy must be geared to a subtler exploitation of the conflict between the Eastern and Western blocs. Our aim in the immediate future must be to regain full sovereignty for Western Germany, which will eventually result in the restoration of freedom of action to the whole of Europe. With accelerated speed we are approaching the point at which we must liberate Europe from American control. It is Germany's task to take the lead in this campaign. It is up to us to determine the method and the timing. There is the danger that France or England, or perhaps even both jointly, will return to an independent policy. One or the other of these powers might come to an agreement with Russia and, in either case, this would be at the expense of Germany and the United States. Such a possibility must be avoided at all cost. Germany must remain the decisive factor in European politics, and it is up to her to give the word at the right time. German foreign policy must be directed with a view to steering Europe clear from another world conflict. Conditions for such policy are favorable. The European nations long for peace. The self-interests of France and England categorically demand that a new Holocaust must be avoided. The interests of the Vatican run along the same lines. Our paramount attention must be devoted to the preservation of German strength and its native potential. Erhaltung der Staatssubstanz. World political events could take such a turn that a situation may emerge in which Russia, North America and a great part of Asia may become the battleground for a third world war, whereas Europe might be spared. Were Russia to give a guarantee to the European countries that she would abstain from attacking them, then the whole of Europe could take a neutral stand in the event of a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The prevalent mood in every country of Europe is against war, and in England broad masses of the people are convinced that the next war will be one provoked by America. If, therefore, we were to succeed in obtaining from Russia a guarantee that she would respect the neutrality of Europe, then the United States could be confronted with a similar demand, and the war could thus be confined to the territories of both great victorious powers and their vassals. In this manner, German strength, Deutsche Substanz, and the resources of Europe would be safeguarded against annihilation. Such an outlook may seem fantastic at the moment, but the policy recommended, Realpolitisierung, is the only realistic one which should be followed by Europe today. A war of exhaustion between Russia and America, in which Europe could be spared, would automatically result in the upsurge of a third power bloc. If the continent of Europe succeeds in preserving its strength, it would thus regain the leadership in the world. There are reliable reports that such a policy would have the quiet but vigorous support of the Vatican. It is entirely to the interest of the Roman Catholic Church to see to it that the Orthodox Slavs, Schismaticis Slaventum, and the predominant Protestant North American continent, must be weakened for a long time to come. In view of the present world political situation, Realpolitik, the policy of orientation towards the West has lost all meaning or sense. A conscious policy of neutrality, going hand in hand with close economic cooperation with the East, would, from a long-range point of view, supersede a merely pro-Soviet orientation. The former would finally bring about our freedom, while the last would keep us in the status of vassals. We must not forget that Germany has always considered orientation towards the West as a policy of expediency, or one to be pursued only under pressure of circumstances. Such was the case in Napoleon's time, after 1918, and also after 1945. All of our great national leaders have constantly counseled the long-range policy of close cooperation with the East. Thus, Frederick the Great, Count von Stein, Bismarck, von Seeckt, Brockdorff-Rantzau, and, in the past 30 years, all our leading geopoliticians. By the end of 1940, Hitler's policy had run into a blind alley, Zwangslage, and the hard decision had to be made to ensure by means of the sword access to the gigantic sources of raw materials in the East, which Russia would never have delivered voluntarily, and without which we never could expect to force a showdown against the Anglo-American bloc. Our present policy must be to overcome the consequences of our previous mistakes. An emasculated Germany should never allow itself to be used as a spearhead in an attack against the Russian colossus. This would be an insane act, once in experiment, and would spell our final doom. whereas Germany as the exponent of European neutrality could gain far-reaching concessions from the Soviets. As we have pointed out again and again, the Russians have no desire whatsoever to burden themselves with all the difficulties and complex problems of Europe. They would consider a neutral and well-intentioned Europe, exerting its influence also on the Arab world and Latin America, as the best solution. We must not let ourselves become befogged by Washington's stupid and meaningless slogans about the struggle of democracy versus communism. The so-called American democracy does not deserve the sacrifice of the bones of even a single German soldier. In the age of regimented and militarized economy, the babbling about democracy and so-called free enterprise is such nonsense that we need not squander a single moment in refuting this American propaganda swindle. What Germany needs in the future is not democracy but a system of statecraft similar to that of the Soviet dictatorship, which would enable the political and military elite in Germany to organize the industrial capacity of Europe and the military qualities of the German people for the revival of the German race and the re-establishment of Europe as the power center in the world. 3. Korea, a risky gamble for Washington. American intervention in Korea is dangerous playing with fire. It could easily become the beginning of a third world war. Up to now Moscow has shown great restraint, but it is difficult to guess what is shaping up behind the facade of the accelerated peace offensive. The Americans have staked their whole prestige on the gamble in Korea. Even if the Americans should succeed in maintaining a foothold on the southern tip of the peninsula for an undetermined period of time, they would find it difficult to pull out of the Korean adventure without damage to their prestige. After committing herself to intervention, the United States would not be able to pull out. She would have to show the world her determination to bring about her world order. From the military strategic point of view, the Korean undertaking entails the greatest risk. Were war with Russia to break out tomorrow, then the Yankees, Amos, would find themselves caught in the Korean mousetrap. However, from the political point of view, the Korean intervention camouflaged as a UN undertaking is a very bold move. It isolated Russia and at one stroke created a world coalition of the United Nations against communism. If the Korean conflict were to expand tomorrow into a world war, then 50 nations would automatically be lined up on the side of the United States against the Soviet bloc. An extraordinarily clever feat. There is, however, one doubtful element in American planning. Do the interests of all countries, great and small, the European as well as the Asian, conform with those of the United States? There are indications that the British have supported United States policy in Korea only half-heartedly. If the Americans are thrown out of Korea, then British prestige in the whole of Asia would suffer. But even if the Yankees should prove victorious, then the hatred of all Asia would be roused with the same intensity against the British as against the Americans. The British view with great distaste the clumsy hand of Washington meddling in their Asiatic affairs. London remembers with great bitterness the noisy pro-Indian propaganda carried on in the United States during the war. London realizes that not Russia but the United States must be blamed as the gravedigger of the British Empire. The United States entered the World War supposedly to save England, but worked with great zeal to junk the British Empire. According to this, the memorandum was evidently prepared before the Indian landing by MacArthur in mid-September 1950. The motives for the American adventure in Korea are still shrouded in mystery, but this much is known. Washington waited long for a good opportunity to put its economy on a war footing and to accelerate her mobilization with full speed. The effects of this step on world economy and its political consequences become clearer and clearer day by day. In the course of total mobilization for war, not much will be left of democracy. 4. The political and military strength of the United States. Reliable observers in the United States have pictured the present state of affairs in that country as follows. The United States economy is not ready for war. Stockpiling of essential raw materials has only been pursued to a moderate extent. From the military point of view, the United States is not in best trim. Its armed forces are limited and extremely expensive. Units ready for combat are barely available. The machinery of the various military services is luxurious and marked by squander and misadministration. The United States is by no means ready for war and has not even entered the phase of secret mobilization. Washington politics show all signs of confusion. There is no real planning, nothing has been thoroughly studied nor has anything been organized from a long-range point of view. According to reports received from the states, the Yankees, Amos, have a lot to learn. Even in leading military circles there are abysmal illusions in regard to Russia's economic and military strength. The United States can consider itself very lucky if the war remains confined to Korea. Should Russia desire war, then this would be a most opportune moment for it. Some incident or other could easily be brought about, but for Europe it would be a catastrophe. Today the Yankees, Amos, have political headaches in every nook and cranny of the world. They are not only trapped in Korea, but they are also worried by the uncertain and hectic developments in China, Japan, Iran, Germany, Yugoslavia, Turkey and Africa. There are deep-rooted differences with Great Britain and France and, above all, the Russian bear is poised to spring at any moment. The cowboys in the arena of world politics have gorged themselves in all respects. Although they can throw billions of dollars around, they do not possess top-notch statesmen, planners, military leaders, scientists, nor a people willing to make sacrifices and capable of accomplishing great historic feats. They do not even have an attractive ideal. The crux of American miscalculation is the belief that allies can be bought with dollars. Alliances are not cemented with ideologies but rest squarely on common interests. Alliances too are respected as long as interests remain mutual. But America's interests do not run parallel with those of Asia or Europe, not even with those of Britain or Latin America. The slogan which stirs the world today is the word anti-capitalism. The American people, who were untouched by the destructive course of 2 world wars, are constantly plagued by a guilty conscience. They are bothered by annoying doubt as to whether they always make the right decisions. Too often have they miscalculated and, when something goes wrong, they easily fall victim to a hangover. Great decisions can only be made by a well-prepared people with strong nerves. This is the real reason why Americans have an inferiority complex when dealing with us Germans. The Amos in Germany realize that we Germans possess worthier qualities. No wonder then that high-ranking American officers in Germany and in Washington long for German rearmament. They would certainly feel much better if Germany would, within a short time, put 50 to 80 divisions at their disposal. The higher the difficulties pile up for the Americans, the more favorable become our prospects for successfully overcoming our defeat. The Yankees are willing to pay a high price for our help. This is clear from all confidential reports which we have obtained from circles close to the American High Commissioner. 5. Has Germany an obligation towards the United States? Germany has emerged from the Cold War as the chief beneficiary. That is our great asset in the ledger of the 5-year period since Potsdam. For the first time in the history of nations it has been proven that clever propaganda, especially when it is camouflaged and directed through other channels, accomplishes far more than the mightiest army or the best diplomatic service of a smoothly functioning state. It is a great mistake to assume that Western Germany, cf. Our confidential report of May 1948, the Vatican as a political factor in the Cold War, recuperated so quickly thanks to America's sympathetic concern for us. We repeatedly encounter, especially as expressed by some politicians in Bonn, the idiotic opinion, but the Americans have put us back on our feet, should we therefore not show our gratitude? To this our answer is as follows. The Americans put us back on our feet, not purely for altruistic reasons but for their selfish interests and on the basis of clever calculation. It must not be our worry but theirs if in the last resort their calculations prove to be abysmally stupid. We are not wholly innocent in the shift of America's post-war policy. For us the war has never stopped and, as is well known, in war every ruse is permissible. We cannot repeat too often that Germany never has ceased to carry on the war with political weapons and propaganda, with economic sabotage and other means. In order to protect Germany against total destruction of its military and economic potentials, as planned at Yalta, we blueprinted a bold plan and created a flexible and smoothly working organization which, at the end of the war, provided the precondition for all the gains that by necessity emerged for Germany out of the chaos of the post-war period. All our calculations at that time were not fulfilled without a hitch. Some of our expectations proved faulty. We had to sail around dangerous cliffs, and the German people had to suffer for a while, even under conditions deliberately created by ourselves. It even seemed at times as though every effort was in vain and that all our hopes had to be given up. Today, however, 5 years after Potsdam, we can look back with pride on our accomplishments. Future historians will one day reveal the great vision with which responsible leaders of the Third Reich created with confident determination those measures which subsequently smashed the united front of the enemy and made Germany again a much-desired partner in a new politico-strategic alliance. And all this was accomplished at the time when German leaders had to go through the severe crisis of the oncoming defeat. By no means did the political and military leadership of the Third Reich skid into the catastrophe in an irrational manner, as so many blockheads and ignoramuses often tell us. The various phases and consequences of the so-called collapse, Zusammenbruch, were thoroughly studied and planned by the most capable experts, Verhigst and Kopfen. Nothing occurred by chance, everything was carefully planned. The result of this planning was that, already a few months after Potsdam, the condition of the victors went on the rocks. The decision for a Western or Eastern orientation was influenced by the factors of Realpolitik. In the light of conditions prevailing in 1945, we could expect from only the West, or rather from the United States, moderate conditions for an armistice, measures of relief, and a sympathetic understanding. Only in America did there exist at that time a small but influential group who had not fallen victim to the hate and revenge outcry of the Jewish triumvirate Rosenfeld-Morgenthau-Baruch, but had maintained in a well-concealed but consistent manner throughout the war its sympathy for Germany. The machinery which we had prepared so carefully in advance had consciously brought about conditions and situations which after the collapse confronted America's political leaders with the choice of accepting chaos and Bolshevism throughout Germany, or adopting a constructive program that would save Germany and the whole of Europe. Such a plan and such a bold program could only be successfully carried out by a politically well-trained people as the Germans. The 12 years of intense political schooling now proved to have been of paramount importance. When we take into consideration under what tremendous difficulties and dangers the organization had to work in an underground manner and directed from abroad without any protection or backing by any state, carefully watched and persecuted by agents of a revengeful enemy, then the successful outcome seems like a miracle. In order to bring the Americans back to reason and away from Potsdam, we organized chaotic conditions in a thorough and systematic manner. Haben wir mit gründlicher Systematik das Chaos organisiert. It was a subtle political resistance, seemingly unorganized and seldom visible, but nonetheless having a deadly effect. The peasants were delivering almost next to nothing to the cities. No coal was brought up from the pits. The wheels of industry were not turning. The people came near to starvation. The monetary systems were disintegrating. There remained nothing for the Yankees to do but to give in and scrap the Potsdam program. Soon thereafter the Western Zone received food supplies, local self-government, extensive economic help, credits for currency reform and, finally, broad political self-determination. Today we are on the last stage towards complete sovereignty. Through superb planning and disciplined use of the political weapon of quiet resistance, the German people have brought to naught the plans for revenge of the victors. By forcing the Americans to give in, the first broad cracks were caused in the Yalta and Potsdam agreements. As a consequence, not only did the front of our enemies break wide apart, but the Soviets too were forced to abandon their mad program of destruction in eastern Germany. Thus it was proven that the excellent political skill and remote control of a well-trained people can score such great successes even after total military defeat as have never before been recorded in history. This could only have been achieved by the leaders of the Third Reich through superb planning in the realm of psychological and political warfare within the United States before and even during the war. Just as Clausewitz declared that war is merely an extension of action by other means, so the German people continued the war after the collapse by propaganda and other means. Despite sacrifice and hardship, The German people won this political war along the whole front. It is our great asset in the ledger of geopolitical schooling and planning that 5 years after Potsdam, the aims of our enemies have been abandoned, Germany's strength has been preserved, and the fatherland can look forward to a revival rich in possibilities. The revival of Germany was not a gift of the Americans but exclusively the result of our own far-sighted planning. The first overwhelming success of this planning was achieved through our well-organized anti-Morgenthau campaign. We thereby succeeded in undermining Roosevelt's plans of revenge against Germany and created total confusion in Washington. By keeping Germany industrially strong and by gaining the support of influential senators and representatives in the American Congress for our propaganda against the dismantling of large industrial enterprises, we finally succeeded in preserving Germany as the leading industrial power in the heart of Europe. Thus the plans of Potsdam and Yalta came to naught and the period of the Cold War began, which developed into a struggle between the East and the West on the decisive question as to who should exploit German industry and within whose orbit Germany's industrial potential should be incorporated. In this way, Germany gained valuable time for further maneuvering. Thus, without a doubt, the correctness of our earliest planning was proved, which anticipated that orientation towards the West would open up great possibilities for the speedy overcoming of our military defeat. In 1945, orientation towards the East would have been totally wrong. It could only have stirred up the West against us and, in view of the deep-rooted hatred of the Russians at that time against everything German, it would have brought common action of our enemies against us and would have spelled finis to all our aspirations. Thanks, however, to our correct decisions, the situation has changed entirely today. We are now once again in the position to influence the turn of events. Today we are again making history. 5 years after Potsdam, the Yankees are stuck deep in the mud. They are now seeking the advice of our generals, whom they formerly called criminals. They come pleading for our help against Russia, that of which we could never convince the world, namely, the injustice of the policy of revenge, was finally accomplished by the Americans themselves who, speculating on German help, have propounded the necessity for a revision of policy toward Germany. They have even convinced the French and the English of this. The helplessness of the Americans in the midst of this chaotic situation has caused such confusion that, barely 5 years after Potsdam, we have obtained as much as, according to the most optimistic calculations, we had hoped to attain in only 10 to 15 years. 6. The expellees. Die Heimatvertrieben. The millions of expellees have to be regarded as a valuable trump card in our policy towards the restoration of German power. When our enemies were drunk with victory, they did not recognize the danger of their short-sighted policy of revenge which might one day arise from the banishment of millions of people. The expulsion of 10 million German racial comrades, Volksdeutschen, was a blessing for the Reich. The expellees strengthened the biological substance of our race, verstärkten die deutsche Volkssubstanz, and from the beginning they became a valuable asset to our propaganda. Their expellees, discontented with their fate, infused a strong political dynamism in our demands. Very soon we were able to drown out the noisy propaganda about German crimes with our counter-race accusation about the heinous misdeeds, zum Himmelschreiend Unrecht, committed against 10 million German racial comrades. Today the existence of many millions of expellees constantly troubles the guilty conscience of our enemies. Without the pressing problem of the expellees it would certainly not have been so easy to set American relief work in motion on behalf of Germany. The refugees from the East constitute a valuable factor in our coming negotiations with Russia, especially if we will one day demand the return of the stolen territories in the East, or if we should insist on adequate compensation in the West. Those Eastern refugees who settle overseas usually turn out to be good missionaries for our Germandom abroad. They constitute, even in countries far away, an asset for the German race, especially if they stay together in close settlements. The distress of the refugees has created a common political ground among all Germans, regardless of political affiliation. The demand for the restitution of the stolen German territories keeps our political agitation alive. The militant elements among the refugees are working according to the best traditions of National Socialism, whereas the broad masses among the expellees are kept close together in well-disciplined homeland organizations, Landsmannschaftliche Organisational. If the enemy would have kept our racial comrades after the war as second-class citizens, or even as disenfranchised subjects in Poland, in Czechoslovakia and in other regions, it would be far more difficult for us today to bring the territorial issue of the caste on the agenda again. The expulsion of millions of our racial comrades provides us with a heaven-sent opportunity to exacerbate the problem of the bleeding border, Blutentgrenze, and to hammer constantly for its revision. 7. Weltanschauung and world power politics. The great historical accomplishment which overshadows every other deed of Adolf Hitler was his decision, carried out with iron energy, to condition the German people into fighting for their great world political task. The necessity to educate a whole nation for total war had been recognized long before Hitler, but Hitler was the first one who tackled the tremendously difficult problem of getting a firm hold on the people and of organizing them into a unified movement on the basis of National Socialism. The training which the German nation received during the 12 years of National Socialist leadership has created a firm basis on which German world politics will be able to carry on again in the future. The National Socialist Weltanschauung furnishes the intellectual potential, geistiges potential. In the struggle for world supremacy, the future of the world will be decided by the conquering force of a political ideology. Democracy is a wishy-washy term which has found no ear among the German people, notwithstanding the efforts made by the Americans for re-education. No German is willing to fight and die for democracy. The German people, well trained and steeled under National Socialist leadership, are dominated by two sovereign ideas: the concept of a German Reich, and Germany's mission of leadership in the world, Deutsche Frohmission in der Welt. These two ideas have given our people a powerful driving force for the dynamic execution of their world mission. The mystical element and the religious tradition embodied in the concept of the Reich sparks our political mission and is especially attractive within the Catholic world. Even after the collapse, the National Socialist Party continued to work in a camouflaged way, getarnt, in dozens of seemingly innocuous societies and groups, in order to keep alive and undiluted the national outlook of the German people. In the same way as many small brooks go toward making a mighty stream, the various nationalistic and radical groups and their own Reich carried out, almost without exception, worthwhile and powerful propaganda. Each of these groups had its special task and had to adjust its work in line with certain situations and circumstances. However, it was of chief importance to direct the underlying trend of the patriotic propaganda. Obviously, this refers to the 1,000-year history of the Holy Roman Empire. There were times when the secular power of the empire and the spiritual power of the church interpenetrated each other towards the same goal. The more diverse and unconnected these groups appeared on the surface, the less they were apt to arouse suspicion of the occupying authorities, that they were directed and influenced by a central organization. We have placed our confidential agents, observers, and representatives for special assignments in all groups and parties, even among communist organizations and their fronts. The greater the number of organizations controlled and influenced by us, the more effective will be the results of our work. The discontinuation of the Nationalist Socialist press after the collapse deprived us of the most important weapon for national indoctrination. Secret circular letters and leaflets reach only a limited number of party comrades who, in most cases, already knew the directives to be followed and propagated in given situations. The victors had tried to suppress every expression of national feeling. They filled the editorial offices of the licensed newspapers with Jews and traitors. Nonetheless, there were some periodicals which first abroad and then in their zone did their best to fight courageously and frankly, sometimes in a cleverly camouflaged manner, for the national interests of Germany. Praiseworthy work was accomplished by the German press in South and North America. In the past few years some papers in the English and American zones achieved excellent results in line with our great national aim. The political articles in Die Zeit of Hamburg, and the intelligent advice given by the paper on delicate domestic problems deeply influenced the political thinking of the German people. In Argentina, Der Weg and the Free Press have striven in an extraordinary manner to create a distinct political approach among Germans abroad, as well as in his own Reich. The German press in North America, especially the New York Staatszeitung, proved of great value in battling the hate psychosis and in its efforts to re-establish close German-American relations. There are also numerous small papers in the United States which, in the midst of the most intense German hate wave, interceded bravely and fought with unbelievable courage for the resurrection of a united fatherland. It was most difficult for the German press to deal delicately with 224 Germany plots with the Kremlin. The events of July 20, 1944. The less these events are discussed, the better it will be for Germany's future. A split among the German people on this question would prove disastrous. There are many angles which obviously cannot as yet be discussed openly. There were thousands who had reason, or were even ordered to protect themselves by camouflaging as anti-Nazis. Hitler-Jenner. Persons who were at that time reported as having been shot are still among the living today. Let us also bear in mind that Dr. Lee's statement about the blue-blooded swine served the definite purpose of deceiving the enemy. Our leaders must see to it that the ever-occurring discussions about the events of the 20th of July be either stopped or, if possible, passed over lightly. Previous directives remained valid. No information whatsoever should be revealed about the background of that affair. The convulsive effects of the military defeat have not broken the German spirit. The national tradition is carefully fostered among the youth and the veterans. The biological substance of the German people remained unshaken in its foundation. Our people are ready to be called upon for historic decisions. A nation which has lost 2 world wars in the short span of 30 years but is already again conscious of its future tasks, can never be defeated. National training and political schooling have conditioned the German people as a first-class instrument for the execution of world politics on a grand scale. No other people on earth has such political maturity, fanatical faith, ironclad willpower and flexibility in tactics, and not merely to overcome defeat but also to start again from scratch. German tradition and belief in a world mission uplifts the whole German nation. Everyone feels within his deepest consciousness that the great national task of the struggle for world domination will ultimately be crowned with victory. The Hoheit is the chief characteristic of the independence of a state and the freedom of its actions. A nation which has lost its. This term blue-blooded swine was used by Dr. Lee in an inciting speech and refers to those aristocratic circles which were supposedly involved in the plot against Hitler's life on July 20, 1944. Hoheit is the German term describing a country's exclusive prerogative to determine the size and disposition of its armed forces. Hoheit is no longer free. After the First World War, the victor permitted the Reich Limited Wehrmacht, but our whole national struggle up to 1935 centered around the question of the re-establishment of a German Wehrmacht. Only then, when we shall again be able to determine in unhampered freedom whether and to what extent we shall rearm ourselves, and when and against whom we may use our armed forces, will we have regained our Wehrmacht. We, in all probability, will have attained Wehrmacht as a result of German rearmament, which will not only be permitted but even urgently desired by the Western powers. The problem of the re-establishment of a German Wehrmacht is a delicate one and requires great cleverness and astute statesman-like minds in order to make the correct decisions at the right time. Germany must concentrate all its efforts on regaining her Wehrmacht. Washington's obstinate efforts to rearm the West German Federal Republic and to make it a strong military partner, within or outside the Atlantic Pact, come as no surprise. In previous circular letters we have frequently mentioned the plans of influential American circles who, even in the midst of war, opposed Roosevelt's policy of revenge and who strongly advocated the preservation of a mighty Germany as a bulwark against the East. The turn of historic events has, however, shown that all the hopes which German leadership placed in the friendly intentions of these personalities in the United States were grossly exaggerated. The systematically whipped-up hatred toward Germany incited the American people so thoroughly that those personalities, high-ranking military, church leaders, politicians, and captains of financier who were working for a policy of reconciliation, could express their views only with the utmost circumspection and execute it through time-consuming detours. The American policy of reconciliation with Germany was very advantageous because it gave us a breathing spell at the very beginning. It was precisely this policy which smashed the Allied front. Moscow's goal was the annihilation of the German power potential, a military, political and economic for good. Yalta proclaimed the aim of a brutal peace diktat which left the vanquished no hope of revival. To our great misfortune, 3 influential men in commanding positions in the West advocated the same idea of annihilation: Roosevelt, Morgenthau and Baruch. These men were joined by the German hater Churchill. Only Roosevelt's death opened the way to those forces who advocated a positive or, at least, a more moderate program towards Germany, and whose blueprints for a post-war world were entirely opposed to those of Roosevelt. These circles recognized in the Russian victory a strengthening of communism, and they feared its complications and the shattering effects it entailed for the capitalistic system. These considerations resulted in a plan first formulated secretly in Washington and later openly discussed, aiming at the creation of a united Europe as a bulwark against Russia, with the proviso that a strengthened and rearmed Germany be incorporated in such a combination. What the Americans therefore now expect from us are combat units and the manufacture of war material. That is why Washington, right from the beginning, was not in favor of dismantling the German war potential. What consequences can be expected for Germany from Washington's present policy? At first we gained great advantages from America's policy. The Morgenthau plan was never really executed. Instead, the Americans endeavored to make Western Germany a strong economic, and now even a military bulwark against the East. The help we obtained from America after the war, and this for egotistic and not for altruistic reasons, will bring us to a point where its further acceptance might create great danger for Germany. We are now approaching this point with giant strides. The Americans fondly hope that we will one day repay with our blood all the benefits we received from them. They want us to sign a pact whereby we, as mercenaries and vassals, will back American power politics. The West German Republic cannot and must never give its consent to such a tie-up, which is already prescribed by our exposed geographic position. Exponenti geopolitis lake. The American plan would make Germany the spearhead of an attack at the heart of Russia. Germany would thereby become the battlefield in a war of annihilation from which nothing would be spared of the German biological substance. A German statesman who would lend his help to such a criminal act would thus stamp himself automatically as a traitor of the German people. However long we may continue to milk the Americans of millions of dollars, there must come the inevitable moment when we shall have to make it crystal clear to them that we are not willing to join the fight against Russia for American interests. There probably is no danger that we shall become hated by the Yankees for this, because they are businessmen and understand very well that we will act only in accordance with our own interests. How should Germany proceed diplomatically in the present situation? It is openly stated in Washington that Europe cannot be defended without German help. The Americans are becoming insistent and we must give them some hope, but we must at the same time point to the fact that the German people are hesitant and not inclined to defend Europe so long as Germany is treated as a defeated nation. By constantly squeezing concessions out of the victors, we can best prepare the way towards the re-establishment of our Hoheit. During the coming weeks and months we must extract the utmost in concessions. We will therefore not be able to avoid making promises. It is of the greatest importance for the resumption of Germany's respected standing in the world to fight for the re-establishment of German honor. We have to undo the shame of the judgments motivated by revenge, Nuremberg war crimes trial, etc., which the victors executed on the military and civic leaders of the Third Reich. The offerings which the Americans could make in this respect would cost them nothing. To save a few dozen brave men from the gallows and to free a few hundred from the prisons, should not prove too difficult to accomplish if the Bonn government would take a resolute stand. To obtain such a token of friendship from the Yankees, we could even give them some promises. But there is a difference between mere promises and such commitments as would bind us irrevocably. We must ultimately remain free in our decisions towards all sides, even if we are obliged for reasons of expediency to agree formally to such obligations. We should reap all advantages but never commit ourselves. The Yankees need us today more urgently than ever before. Clever political tactics today could bring about the conditions for the definite acknowledgement of our Wayhoheit, but it must not lead so far that, in case of a showdown, we would have to pull Washington's chestnuts out of the fire. We must pursue realpolitik, that is, our honor must be restored and we must regain freedom. Prospects for the future. The international unrest and the tension between the East and the West have greatly facilitated execution of our plans up till now. The surprising and rapid revival of the German economy and the debate on the Schuman Plan have, however, prematurely focused the attention of the world on the resurrected Germany. The war in Korea served as a desired diversion. The fact that the Americans would now like us to join them in the defense of Europe and become their ally will thereby enhance our bargaining power with the Russians. The Americans have lost the peace, the Cold War, and their entire future, but they are not as yet aware of it. After the failure of their amateurish policies in Asia, the Americans will one day experience a far more painful and devastating smash-up in Europe. Ein Nukuite Painlichen Kladradak in Europa. The outcome will be as we predicted as long ago as 1944. They will rouse the whole world against them. Those dollar diplomats and cowboys are too untalented to cope with the problem of world politics, Weltpolitik. Their silly chatter that American troops are in Germany for the purpose of protecting Occidental culture is so idiotic that it could not make the slightest impression even on the most humble stable boy in Germany. We should grab a few more billions from the Yankees' huge dollar chest and then kick them out. Einsteigers and Die Frisluftssetzen, or simply hand them over to the Russians. A few little hints and threats would perhaps make them scram in time. The first phase of our policy of disruption, Springungspolitik, is behind us. America's financial assistance can never bring about a permanent solution. On the contrary, it will cause enfeeblement and lead to general corruption. These unpleasant byproducts are becoming visible in France and Britain to an ever-increasing greater degree than in truncated Germany. The dollar diplomats behave as though they were the true lords in the salons of Europe. Germany lost her sovereignty as a consequence of the military defeat. Paris and London, however, sold their birthright for a mess of pottage. Verkauften die Hausrecht gegen Dollar and Lehen. The struggle against American bossing, Bevmundung, of Europe will become Germany's main task in the future. We must not merely strive to shake off the shackles with which Washington has bound us, and labor to regain our freedom of action in the East, but we must also prepare the whole of Europe for our future mission in the world. A well-filled breadbasket, sufficient sources of raw material and the necessary geopolitical space for strategic maneuverings, Möglichkeiten im Geopolitischen Raum, will one day prove more than ever before to be the most important factors in deciding Europe's struggle for world mastery. The strategy of breaking the chains of our enthrallment, Fesselnspringen, is sometimes more daring and dangerous than the most dashing feat in war. We could, for instance, visualize that through secret negotiations with Moscow a situation would be brought about whereby the Yankees could overnight be eliminated as a power factor in Europe. Such a scheme of course always contains an element of grave danger. Not that such a plan would be impossible of execution, but there is always the question how far the Russians are to be trusted. Other schemes would be preferable from a long-range point of view. We are passing through an interim period of a profound change in international power relations. Everywhere there emerges the desire for a new order and an outspoken aversion against dollar diplomacy. In this extended transitory period, it should prove possible for Germany to build up a new political bloc, new politische Einheit, out of Europe, Africa and Latin America, Iberoamerica. The economic advantages and the political possibilities in such a new power combination would put the United States against the wall. It would then depend entirely on our diplomatic and propaganda finesses when and how we would take over an America enfeebled by its foreign and domestic policies. Such a plan would have the advantage of preventing a third world war fought between United States capitalism and the Soviet bloc, a war which would have the most destructive consequences for the Western world. such a design would still guarantee for some time the preservation of the resources of the Western world, and then, greatly strengthened, we will enter under Germanic leadership the phase of a final showdown between the white race and the Slavic world. In the event of such a showdown, we must endeavor to bring to our side the Arab bloc and as many of the Asiatic peoples as possible. Germany is in the fortunate position of not having aroused the hatred of Asia. That we can step in as the leading spokesman for the underdog. The tenacious work of enlightenment carried out by Germany and Italy in the Arab world is now bearing fruit. Anti-British and anti-American resentment is gaining momentum in the entire Middle East. Britain will not long be able to keep its hold on the Suez Canal, nor maintain her influence in Iran and the rest of the Middle East. The coming revolt of the Arab world will prove another setback for the immature-ish world planners in Washington. A correct evaluation of the Russian problem is important for Germany's future. World War II clearly proved that Germany was not in a position to mobilize the necessary manpower and the tremendous economic reserves to deal the knockout blow which would have destroyed the Slav world forever. Our surprising successes in the Polish and Western campaigns lured our political and military leaders into the belief that they could quickly overrun the Russian armies. And it was demonstrated anew how foolish it was to disregard the wise admonition of Bismarck, who, throughout his life, warned us against making Russia our enemy. It will require the greatest diplomatic efforts to lull Moscow's profound distrust of us. The Cold War has fortunately relegated the memory of Germany's march into Russia to the background far more quickly than we could ever have hoped. But we must not deceive ourselves. Moscow will not forget the Second World War so quickly. The present power position of the Slavic world is a geopolitical reality which we must accept, at least for the time being. Germany's future policy should be the quiet penetration of Europe and must aim at consolidating our spheres of interest in Africa and Latin America. We should avoid as far as possible dangerous propaganda ventures with the expellees which might antagonize the East. Russia may one day be willing to yield or negotiate, but we must never let it come to a struggle for prestige. Germany's industry will regain its previous position. The markets in East and Southeast Europe, in Latin America and in Africa, China and the rest of Southeast Asia offer us a great future. The German memorandum employs the phrase unsere Interessen in Africa and Latin America, whereas in fact the Germans have not as yet any spheres of interest in these continents. Nonetheless, in their geopolitical speculations they have already made an Anschluss with Europe and other continents. Eliminate the British and Americans from competition, especially if we conduct our negotiations with the Soviets in a smart way. Our increasing economic power and ability to elbow our way politically must be employed alternately. A prudent and undeviating policy will make it possible to establish someday a new political order in the world which will supersede the present colossi of the United States and the USSR. Though we are powerless at present, we have nonetheless never permitted ourselves to be disarmed spiritually and scientifically. German scholars are working unremittingly in Germany as well as abroad on great scientific plans for the future. Favorable circumstances enabled us to keep alive the great research organization of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute through a change of name. First-class scientists are working in the fields of interplanetary navigation, Raumschiffahrt, chemistry and on cosmic rays. Our scientists, unhampered in their work, have sufficient time and are planning day and night for Germany's future. It is the German spirit, Geist, that creates modern weapons and that will bring surprising changes in the present relationship of forces. Economic difficulties will one day plunge the United States down from its present dizzy heights. Such a catastrophe can be brought about through crafty manipulations and through artificially engineered crises. Such maneuvers are routine measures which have already been employed in international power struggle and will be used again and again as long as economic rivals fight for power positions and markets in the world. It is quite conceivable that America, weakened by a depression, will one day seek support from a resurrected Germany. Such a prospect would open tremendous possibilities for the future power position of a bloc introducing a new order in the world. This must be our program. Be constantly on the alert, evaluate future developments correctly, and miss no opportunities. It is the duty of a vanquished nation to learn from its defeat, to work with unremitting courage and with ever-increasing determination and endurance, and be prepared for a great world political task. All these possibilities would come to naught if a new world war were to lay Europe waste. It must therefore be our supreme duty to place ourselves in the vanguard of the struggle to keep Europe out of any future war. If we succeed in this, we will surely gain the trust of the people and undisputed leadership in Europe, not excluding Britain. In such a roundabout way we would be able to establish the foundation for future world leadership. The world is longing today for the millennium. In the role of champion for peace, we would gain stature in world public opinion and create for ourselves an unshakable moral position. The propaganda against German militarism would subside entirely. Old charges would be forgotten and Europe would then be willing to follow German leadership. Such a policy can be pursued successfully, especially in view of the present attitude of the Vatican. The Pope is a realist in politics, est realpolitica genug, and knows well enough that, in the age of the atom bomb, there is too much at stake for the Church and for Europe as a whole. The Atlantic partners will always be able to find an opportunity to evade their obligations by pointing out that the provocative behavior of the United States has foolishly brought about a conflict for which the Russians cannot be charged as the aggressor and, therefore, all contractual obligations to help become void. We must do everything possible in accordance with the directives and suggestions given above in order to influence in our favor the political attitude of all groups affiliated with us in Europe, Latin America and the United States. It should also be possible to make it clear to the German element in America what Germany's fate would be were a new world war to annihilate the substance of our race, or if a victorious Russia were to upset or delay for a long time our plans for the future. Completed, Madrid, beginning of September 1950. Distribution, Verteiler, Dr. M.V. T., Bonn, Rome, Barcelona, Buenos Aires, ZA.